Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 8 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll first talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. After we go ahead and present to you guys the most advantageous matchups going into the weekend, some of the matchups we may want to avoid based on certain cornerback coverage going into this upcoming weekend's contest. We'll then transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings as I'll share with you guys my opinions and statistics that justify the reasons as to why I have the position ranked as such going into week 8. Before we begin, of course, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel, commenting down below, and of course, helping the community continue to grow down there. Of course, you guys are answering each other's questions. I'm trying to get there as much as I possibly can, but I do appreciate you guys continuing to support each other. So if you're interested in daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, be sure to subscribe. We are on our way to 80,000 subscribers. Help us reach that goal. And of course, do yourself a favor in helping yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship by subscribing. Thank you very much. Also, we're going to be going ahead and talking about a couple prize pick entries as we kind of progress throughout today's episode in regards to specific player statistic picking more or less. We'll go ahead, we'll talk about a couple entries going into this upcoming weekend. Be sure to travel to the description of the video for those of you who are interested. Check out prize picks, and again, if you sign up and make a first time deposit, you'll be given a first time deposit match up to $100 when you use promo code Andrew. So use the link down in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our week 8 wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right of the screen, we have how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. I just want to remind you guys, yes, we do show these statistics every single week. Tomorrow, on Thursday, I will be doing a rest of season strength of schedule video, which will include the best schedules for the running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback positions for the rest of the way, whether it is the regular season and or the fantasy football playoffs. So be sure to go ahead, keep an eye out for that, as that'll be coming into your direction. Either way, talking about who's giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers, it's the Atlanta Falcons secondary. A.J. Terrell really has fallen off this year. I know he's dealing with an injury. Even if he doesn't play, even if he does play, I think that probably helps the cause of our wide receivers, specifically DJ Moore in that matchup. But ultimately, these have been some of the worst teams against opposing wide receivers, not really being able to stop anybody. The Tennessee Titans, over the course of the last couple weeks here, have been giving up 2 or more touchdowns to almost every single quarterback they have faced, whether it's Carr, Wentz, Ryan. It doesn't really matter. The Tennessee Titans secondary has struggled mightily this season. The Pittsburgh Steelers have tightened it up over the course of the last couple weeks, but still, they are still susceptible to a couple big playmakers. For example, A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith. There's a lot of potential there going into this upcoming weekend's matchups. Either way, just going ahead and giving you some perspective here. On the other end, we have the Denver Broncos, where, of course, Patrick Surtain is locking up everyone. Stephon Gilmore with the Indianapolis Colts locking up everyone. The Cincinnati Bengals secondary, Chidobe Awuzie, has been playing incredible thus far this season. And we're just going to continue to try to avoid some of those cornerbacks because truly they are difference makers. Guys like Sauce Gardner, we do not want to play our wide receivers against. There's a reason why on Sunday morning I told the majority of you not to play Courtland Sutton against that matchup, not only because of the backup quarterback, but because you know that Sauce Gardner is locking up number 1 wide receivers. So Devontae Parker is probably going to be irrelevant this week, but nobody's even starting him. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on. And let's get into our top 36 wide receiver rankings. Of course, we will be presenting you guys the matchup on screen, as you can see, in a 1 through 5 star designation, 5 stars being the easiest matchup and 1 star being a matchup you absolutely want to avoid at all costs. But either way, let's get into this. Beginning with our number 1, we have Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp has been averaging 20.13 half PPR fantasy points per game this season. He's playing about 99% of the offensive snaps. He never comes off the field. Of course, he's going to continue to dominate, and he has another privilege of taking on a division rival in the San Francisco 49ers. Even though the Rams have lost 7 out of the last 7 regular season games against this team, in the last 4 games that Cooper Kupp has participated against the San Francisco 49ers, whether it's regular season or playoffs, Cooper Kupp has been putting up an average of 22.88 fantasy points per game, 7 receptions and 118 receiving yards minimum against that defense. Earlier on this season in week 4, put up 19.2 fantasy points against that secondary. Now, a couple things that you want to mention regarding that secondary. Lenore is going to be their slot cornerback. When we go ahead and look at Cooper Kupp's expanded statistics in regards to slot receiving role, he has had 29 of his 56 total receptions from the slot and 348 of his 607 receiving yards from the slot. So about 50% of his statistics overall is coming from the slot position, even sometimes more than 50%. Now, the main reason I wanted to mention Lenore is because thus far this season as a cornerback, he's allowed the 3rd most targets, 29, the 2nd most receptions, 25, and the 5th most receiving yards, 246, to slot receivers. when you're going ahead and stepping into the batter's box, the phone booth with Cooper Kupp, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble, and that's what I'm expecting. Cooper Kupp should be a massive play this week. Moving on, we have Stefon Diggs. Currently, in terms of fantasy points per game, is the number one overall wide receiver in fantasy football, half PPR. Unbelievable. He's averaging literally a touchdown per game and over 109 receiving yards per game. Incredible numbers across the board, and I don't think he's stopping anytime soon. He takes on the Green Bay Packers. Of course, many of us know that he used to play for the Minnesota Vikings. In the last 7 games that he has played against the Green Bay Packers, he has scored a touchdown in every single game. I think having a little bit of a homecoming back to a former division rival, we're going to have ourselves a pretty big performance here from Stefon Diggs. A couple things that I wanted to mention in regards to his overall potential. Like I was mentioning, he's averaging 109.33 yards per game. As of right now, via Prize Picks, the number is more or less on 82.5 receiving yards. He's been able to surpass that number in 4 out of the last 6 games, and quite frankly, been able to put together 100 plus receiving yards in 4 out of those last 6 games, while in those games putting up 20 plus fantasy points every single time. We're expecting a huge performance here from Stefon Diggs in week 8. Moving on to Justin Jefferson, taking on the Arizona Cardinals. I thought that the Arizona Cardinals, because they hadn't given up too many touchdowns, were a far better secondary. But quite frankly, I think the touchdown number has kind of leaned us in the direction of thinking this is a secondary that's far better than they actually are. When I went ahead and looked at the statistics that Murphy and Wilson had been given up in terms of their primary cornerbacks this season, Murphy's given up the 6th most receptions to opposing wide receivers, 30 so far, and he's given up the 17th most receiving yards. Wilson has given up the 13th most receptions, 25 total, and the 12th most receiving yards, 326. Overall, we got ourselves a great matchup here, especially with Justin Jefferson coming off of the bye week, having 3 consecutive games from weeks 4 through 6 of over 100 receiving yards in every single contest. On top of it, in the last 3 games that we've seen him play, he's garnering a 31.19% target share. If that's going to continue to be the case, a receiver that, quite frankly, looks a lot different this year. When I went ahead and took a little bit of a deeper dive, when you look at his 2020 rookie season, he had a total of 470 yards after the catch. In his sophomore year, 2021, had himself 491 yards after the catch. This season already, in just 6 games, he has 300 yards after the catch. That is a 50 yak per game average in comparison to 29 yak per game in prior seasons. They're allowing him to catch the ball in space and be a dynamic player across the field, making defenders miss and making huge plays after the catch. All right, moving on. We're talking about our number 4, Ja'Marr Chase. Now, of course, Ja'Marr Chase had majority of his fantasy point contribution last week in the first half, literally having 25.7 of his 29 fantasy points in the first half of that game, but mainly had to do with the fact that the game was out of hand. They didn't have to throw the ball in the second half, so they didn't do it at a, accelerated rate like we saw in the first half against that poor Atlanta Falcons secondary, which of course is giving up the most points to fantasy wide receivers thus far this season. Not really a surprise considering the damage that Chase, Boyd, and Higgins all contributed to that secondary. Nonetheless, when we're talking about Chase, this last weekend's performance isn't the first time we've seen it. In fact, we've seen back-to-back performances from Ja'Marr Chase of 7 or more catches, 130 receiving yards or more, and back-to-back games of 2+ receiving touchdowns. That's 28.7 fantasy points in back-to-back games minimum. Now he takes on the Cleveland Browns, and though last season he had struggled against the Cleveland Browns, only putting up 5.9 and 3.6 fantasy points, I think the momentum that this team is coming in on, going up against this defense that, of course, cannot stop the run, they're going to have to stop, of course, Joe Mixon from being able to chunk them for yardage. That's going to open up more opportunities for Ja'Marr Chase down the field, especially considering we have seen Denzel Ward miss the last 2 games. It's a fantastic matchup. Moving on to Tyreek Hill, number 5, taking on the Detroit Lions. Anybody taking on the Detroit Lions, regardless of position, is quite frankly going to find success. And especially when we're talking about the wide receiver at this current moment in time, who leads the wide receiver position in targets, receptions, receiving yards, is number 5 in terms of yards after the catch, is number 2 in terms of wide receiver air yards, is number 2 in terms of wide receiver target percentage within his own team, only behind Cooper Kupp. Tyreek Hill has a 32.37% target percentage within his own team. That is unbelievable. And when we're talking about being number 1 at the top of the list, he's also number 1 in terms of yards per route run, with a 3.16 yard per route run average. That is unbelievable. Now he takes on a Detroit Lions secondary that, of course, really won't be able to bottle up his speed. And they're going to try, but they won't be able to. We've seen a lot of great performances from wide receivers against Detroit Lions. Of course, we've seen Jakobi Meyers go for over 100 and a touchdown. Metcalf over 140. We also saw Lockett in that same game over 90 receiving yards. And the Minnesota Vikings and Washington Commanders, they both ended up putting 2 touchdowns on the board from their wide receivers, Thielen, Osborne. Of course, we saw Jahan Dotson and Curtis Samuel. Great performances across the board, and I think Tyreek Hill is going to join them on that list. Moving on to Davante Adams, our number 6, taking on the New Orleans Saints. Due to the fact that Marshon Lattimore has not been in the lineup, we have seen wide receivers completely dust this secondary. Jamar Chase, of course, most recently, 7 catches, 132 and 2 touchdowns. DeAndre Hopkins last week, 10 catches, 103 receiving yards on 14 targets. But even with Marshon Lattimore in the lineup, we've seen a lot of wide receivers find success. Let's go back a couple weeks before these. We saw Justin Jefferson, 10 catches, 147 against Marshon Lattimore. We even saw DK Metcalf, 5 total receptions, 88 receiving yards, and a touchdown. There have been a lot of great performances, and I think Davante Adams is only going to continue this trend of wide receivers succeeding against this defense. Now, going into this upcoming weekend, his current prize pick number is 88.5. Now, you may be wondering how they came upon that number. Well, when you go ahead and compare weeks 1 through 3 of Davante Adams' production in comparison to weeks 4 through 7, we have seen an influx of quite literally 43 receiving yards per game on average between the first 3 games and the last 3 games that we have seen. And honestly, it's not really a surprise, considering the fact that Josh Jacobs is causing so much damage to defenses and they have to stack the box. It is allowing Davante Adams and his average depth of target to be farther down the field, making big plays, and of course, scoring a bunch of touchdowns. I think the fact that we have, of course, seen his total receptions increase just slightly, but his overall yardage increase has to do with the fact that they're letting it rip down the field and finding a lot of success against secondaries. Moving on to DeAndre Hopkins, our number 7, taking on the Minnesota Vikings secondary. Again, the secondary for this team is going to have their hands full. Whether it is Cameron Dantzler or Chandon Sullivan, both these guys are going to be struggling because, quite frankly, it's DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, he came back last week on a short week and immediately on Thursday night dominated. But it wasn't, all success from the get-go. It took a little bit of time, and after halftime, we saw that there was a little bit of a shift in regards to what Kyler wanted to approach with. Kyler in the beginning of that game wasn't really targeting him much, but in the second half of the game, DeAndre Hopkins garnered 9 total targets. In fact, in the first series of that second half, when I'm watching that game, literally the first 3 throws of the first series of the second half, Kyler goes straight to DeAndre Hopkins 3 consecutive times. There was a conversation probably had at halftime saying, hey, the fact that you didn't throw the ball to me on that goal line fade and you threw it towards Rondale Moore and we settled for a field goal, and then we have to follow up by you not throwing me the ball in the first half, get me the rock. Let's forget about everything else. Let's go. And that's pretty much what's happened. I think going forward, they're going to continue to get the ball in his direction, coming off of a week in which he had a 48.28% target share. Had literally 50% of the completions that Kyler Murray had in terms of total receptions. When you're pretty much 50% of the receiving offense in terms of yardage, targets, completions, of course, we're expecting a lot of success out of him this week. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, unfortunately, Amon-Ra came down with a concussion. And that is something that, we just really can't control. It's a variable out of our control, but hopefully he's going to be ready to go. Hopefully we'll be out of the concussion protocol by Friday. And if that's going to be the case, he's going to be a vital part of this offense succeeding, because when we've seen him fully healthy thus far this season, in the first 2 weeks, when there were 71 total passing attempts from Jared Goff, 24 of those total passing attempts went in the direction of Amon-Ra St. Brown, making it a 33.8% target share. If we're going to continue to see this man get himself lit up with targets, he's going to be extremely valuable for fantasy purposes. This is why I continue to garner as to why we should be trading for him now while you can still buy him low. I mean, just look at what happened once he left the game. Khalif Raymond came in as the primary slot receiver for the rest of the game and had himself 5 receptions for 75 receiving yards. Khalif Raymond isn't a world beater. He isn't a guy that's going to make plays every single week, regardless of what team he's on. Because this team wants to utilize the slot receiver role in the way that they do, and Amon-Ra St. Brown is the talent that he is, I'm expecting him to, of course, get himself a lot of opportunity going forward, especially against this beat-up Miami secondary. Moving on, let's talk about Mike Evans. Speaking of being a little bit beat up, obviously he's kind of dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury, but everyone in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is quite frankly dealing with an injury. We will not have, and it's already confirmed, Russell Gage, Cameron Brate, or Julio Jones participating in Thursday night's game against Baltimore. Baltimore's secondary has tightened up over the last couple weeks. The only question we have is whether or not Mike Evans is going to be at a fully healthy capacity. I'm hoping he's going to be, because what we saw on Sunday against the Carolina Panthers was the most targets that Mike Evans has ever seen in his career from Tom Brady, 15 total. And not only did he put up 14.1 half PPR fantasy points, he also dropped a 64-yard potential touchdown. Unbelievable. Wide open in the beginning of the game. Could have very easily had himself a 25-point fantasy week. Unfortunately, wasn't able to do so. But I think going up against the Baltimore Ravens, if there's no one else to throw the ball to besides Chris Godwin and Mike Evans down the field, I expect both of them to be littered with 15 plus targets in something of that capacity, because it is going to be tough against the secondary. So they're going to have to throw the ball for a majority of that game. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb. The biggest problem I have with CeeDee Lamb isn't his talent, it's Dak Prescott. I mean, I cannot get over the fact that Dak Prescott comes out after his injury and immediately goes to CeeDee Lamb only 6 times, only 6 targets for 4 receptions and 70 receiving yards against the Detroit Lions of all secondaries. But hey, maybe it's going to change. I'm going to be a little bit optimistic, okay, guys? I'm not going to panic. I'm going to take a deep breath, and we're just going to relax here. But quite frankly, it is concerning to see that CeeDee Lamb has only had 4 out of the last 16 games that he has played with Dak Prescott consist of 10 or more targets. When they're both healthy, they should be absolutely dominating, and there should be a concerted effort to get him the ball at least 5 times per half. You know, just a couple targets per quarter. We're not asking for much. We want double-digit targets, maybe 3 targets per quarter. That's not much to ask. Get him the ball and let him dominate, because we know he's one of the most talented receivers in the game right now. Now, of course, he takes on the Chicago Bears. The Chicago Bears secondary has, quite frankly, only given up 6 receptions or more to one singular receiver this year, and that's Justin Jefferson. No other wide receiver has been able to accomplish that. Luckily, for at least CeeDee Lamb, in 4 out of the last 6 games that he has participated in, he's been able to produce more than 70.5 receiving yards. If, in fact, you guys are participating in the prize pick entries for this upcoming weekend, I think there is a very good chance the targets potentially increase into a positive direction, and of course, the yardage is going to continue as such. Moving on, let's talk about Deebo Samuel. Even though Deebo Samuel is coming off the worst week of his season, and he broke his streak of double-digit fantasy points, he luckily takes on the Los Angeles Rams. The Los Angeles Rams has been like a lucky rabbit's foot for him. Every time he takes on that secondary, he somehow manages to dominate. In the last 6 games, from 2020 to 2022 that he's played against the LA Rams, whether it's regular season or postseason, he has averaged 7 targets per game, 6 catches per game, 96 receiving yards, and a touchdown per game against the LA Rams defense, averaging 21.17 half PPR fantasy points per game since 2020. Unbelievable production. Now, I'm not even including some of the rushing yard games he had there. I've excluded the rushing yards as a whole because, quite frankly, he hasn't been running the ball much. And with Christian McCaffrey there, I'm expecting him to maybe get 1 or 2 rushing attempts maximum in this game. Now, I do want to go ahead and play a little bit of devil's advocate. If, in fact, Deebo Samuel is to struggle at all, it's not going to be because of Christian McCaffrey. It's going to be because of the utilization of Brandon Aiyuk getting 11 targets in the last 2 consecutive weeks and George Kittle becoming George Kittle once again. Because they have Trent Williams back, they don't have to use George Kittle as a blocking threat in the passing game. He can now extend his game out, and just like last week, 18 plus fantasy points, be an extreme threat down the field, especially against the LA Rams secondary. Moving on to the final of our wide receiver ones, let's talk about AJ Brown. When I went ahead and collected the averages that AJ Brown has put forth thus far this season, averaging about 13.13 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, 8.83 targets, 5.5 receptions, 83 receiving yards per game, and 0.33 receiving touchdowns per game. So basically scoring a touchdown 1 out of every 3 games. And that makes sense considering the amount of passing touchdowns Jalen Hurts has. Doesn't even have over 10 thus far this season, and that's probably going to continue to be the case. I mean, he's just not a throwing quarterback in regards to when they get down into the red zone. He's a rushing quarterback, and there's a reason why he has 10 rushing attempts inside the 5 for 5 rushing touchdowns, and Miles Sanders managers are crying. But either way, they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers, and quite frankly, we've seen a lot of great performances against this defense as of late. Of course, whether it is Waddle or Hill going over, 70 receiving yards each, I'm perfectly fine with that. Of course, they weren't able to put a touchdown into that performance, but as long as we have seen consistent production from wide receivers, that's great. Of course, now we saw Diggs and Gabriel Davis both go for over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown against the secondary, so we know there is potential for extreme upside. The thing that I wanted to mention before I continue and we get to the wide receiver 2 conversation is the fact that AJ Brown has had 53 total targets this year and only 33 receptions. If those numbers are going to increase in any sort of capacity, I think these kind of prize pick numbers of 70.5 are kind of soft. I think we should very easily be able to go more than that if, in fact, he's catching the ball 70% of the time. But unfortunately, hasn't been the case, which has been his primary struggle. All right, let's go ahead, give you guys a visual representation as of what our top 12 looks like at the wide receiver position going into Week 8. Again, rankings are subject to change. If anything happens, whether it's trades, injuries, anything of that extent, whether it's offense or defense, rankings will change. And if you want to go ahead and get my updated rankings, you can go ahead and join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on the channel. I'll be live streaming, giving you guys updated rankings on screen for Week 8 of the 2022 fantasy football season in terms of all 4 primary positions: running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end. Thank you. All right, moving on to our wide receiver 2 conversation. We begin with Chris Olave. Chris Olave is going to be in a perfect position this week because they have already confirmed that Andy Dalton is going to be the starting quarterback. I'm assuming that they're going to allow Andy Dalton to be the starter until we see Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry come back, just to see if Andy Dalton can get the job done with better receiving options. Either way, what he has done with Chris Olave as of the last 3 weeks has been incredible. I mean, Chris Olave is coming off of a week in which he had 14 targets, 100 receiving yards, 14 fantasy points, a great overall performance despite not even having a touchdown within that entire game, while Andy Dalton still threw for 4 passing touchdowns for the New Orleans Saints. Now, with Andy Dalton under center, we've seen Chris Olave have 3 consecutive games of 13.4 plus fantasy points at the wide receiver position. He currently leads the league in air yards with 912. He's also one of the top receivers in terms of targets total and average depth of target. 16.29 yards down the field on his average depth of target is absolutely ridiculous. And if the numbers continue to trend in that direction, of course, we're going to see some big plays out of Chris Olave. Thing that I wanted to mention before we move on is the fact that Russell Wilson and Davis Mills most recently each threw for 2 touchdowns against the Las Vegas Raiders. Why not Andy Dalton in this upcoming weekend's matchup? Moving on to Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle continues his streak. In the games that he has played with Tua starting in his career, there's been 14 contests. He has averaged over 80 receiving yards in those contests. We're going to continue to see those numbers climb just like last week where he had 4 receptions for 88 receiving yards. Of course, they take on Detroit, like I mentioned with Tyreek Hill. The secondary has been burnt by a lot of receivers, specifically slot receivers like Jakobi Meyers for 111 receiving yards on 7 catches and a touchdown. Tyler Lockett, 6 catches, 91. We have seen a lot of wide receivers find success, and they're not going to slow down anytime soon. Currently on PrizePicks, the number is 65.5. That number is so easily achievable. That is probably my favorite overall entry going into the week for week 8 of the wide receiver position. Moving on, let's talk about T. Higgins. Again, T. Higgins has been one of the best wide receivers of the league in terms of his consistency in yardage. Now, touchdowns unfortunately haven't been there, but for those of you who watched the game, he was literally tackled just short of a touchdown, and so was Tyler Boyd. Those guys could have had themselves massive performances along with Jamar Chase. Unfortunately, tackled short, it happens. Either way, in 15 out of the last 18 games that T. Higgins has played, whether it's regular season or postseason, when he has been healthy and has not left the game due to an injury, he has been able to put up 70 or more receiving yards. If, in fact, we do end up seeing later on in this week, because I know PrizePicks hasn't put up his number right now because they play on Monday night. If, in fact, his number is anything even close to 70 receiving yards, we're taking them more on that, and we're not regretting it in any sort of capacity. Moving on to Gabriel Davis. Gabriel Davis has been fantastic. In the last 2 weeks, he's averaging 6 targets, only 3 catches, but he's averaging 122 receiving yards and 1.5 receiving touchdowns per game. Those kind of numbers are not sustainable. But I will say, in the 3 full healthy games that he has participated in this year, okay, of course, the last 2 ones that we've seen in weeks 5 and 6 and in week 1, those 3 games, he's totaled 17 targets, 10 catches, 333 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, and 57.3 fantasy points. That's a 19.1 fantasy point per game average when healthy. If we're going to continue to see something of that capacity, well, Gabriel Davis obviously can get himself into the wide receiver 1 conversation every single week. Going up against Jair Alexander, Rasul Douglas, it's not going to be easy. But when you have Stefon Diggs pulling so much coverage on the other side of the field, and the Buffalo Bills are designing plays for him to take the top off the defense, it's pretty easy for Gabriel Davis to accomplish. Moving on to Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin, in back-to-back weeks, we have seen him produce a minimum of 12 targets. 13 targets in week 6 and 12 this last week. Obviously, the total yardage that we saw this last week wasn't optimal, but I still think there's a very good chance that without all the receiving options of Russell Gage, Julio Jones, Cameron Brate all out, and Leonard Fournette not looking great as of late, this is going to lead to a lot of passing down the field. If Mike Evans is to potentially miss this game and or be limited in any capacity, we could see 15 targets go in the direction of Chris Godwin. Obviously more valuable in a full PPR format rather than a half PPR. But as of right now, the thing that I wanted to mention, Williams, the slot corner for the Baltimore Ravens, he has, according to Pro Football Focus, the 6th lowest coverage grade amongst all cornerbacks in the National Football League right now. If we're going to continue to see, of course, funnel targets in the direction of Chris Godwin, I'm expecting a big game from him this week. Moving on, DeVonta Smith, the thumbnail for today's episode. DeVonta Smith has been unbelievable. I mean, the reason why I have him as my thumbnail is because I wanted to prove a point and potentially tell you guys to trade for him. And I'll tell you exactly why. Since week 2, DeVonta Smith is averaging more fantasy points per game than his wide receiver mate, A.J. Brown. Can you imagine that? In fact, when you go ahead and compare their statistics, even though A.J. Brown has 40 targets in comparison to DeVonta Smith's 39 targets, we have seen DeVonta Smith have 10 more receptions, 50 more receiving yards, and just as many receiving touchdowns. he has produced quite literally 10 more fantasy points since week 2 in comparison to A.J. Brown. If anything, DeVonta Smith is the number one wide receiver of this offense. And if that's going to continue to be the case, averaging 7.8 targets, 6.6 receptions, 79 receiving yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns since week 2, these numbers continue to climb, especially against a advantageous matchup like the Pittsburgh Steelers. You might want to buy him now before it's too late. Moving on, let's talk about Christian Kirk taking on the Denver Broncos. Considering the fact that Patrick Surtain is going to be locking down one side of the field, whether it is Zay Jones or Marvin Jones, I think Christian Kirk, quite frankly, is the only person that's going to catch the ball within this offense. Because he's the slot wide receiver, because he's, of course, getting himself a higher range of targets overall on a weekly basis in comparison to the other receivers in this offense, we should probably see a big week here. Now, I do want to mention, for those of you who saw the final game of the contest between the New York Giants and the Jacksonville Jaguars, Christian Kirk was tackled on the 1-yard line as time expired. He very easily could have scored a touchdown there and had himself a massive 20-point week. Wasn't able to accomplish that, but either way, the fact that they take on the Denver Broncos, it does have him a little bit lower in terms of my rankings than typically, considering the Denver Broncos are giving up the second fewest passing yards to opposing offenses in the league. The best offense in that capacity has been the Green Bay Packers thus far. Otherwise, the Denver Broncos, of course, are number 2 with Patrick Surtain leading the way. Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Lockett taking on the New York Giants. Another one of these defenses that have played relatively well, but if we expect to see DK Metcalf probably miss this week with the injury that he sustained on Sunday, there's a very good chance that Tyler Lockett continues to get himself a lot of exposure in the passing game, coming off of a week with 8 targets, but only 7 catches and 45 yards. It was kind of suspicious to me. So when I went ahead and I watched that game, dude, his average depth of target was really close to the line of scrimmage. It literally was 5.1 yards. That is not Tyler Lockett-esque numbers, especially considering when you compare it to weeks 4 through 6, where his average depth of target in those games, 19.0, 23.5, 15.6. If we can unlock Tyler Lockett, let him go out for far deeper routes down the field, and of course, Geno Smith is confident enough to let it rip, we should have a big game here against the New York Giants as the primary number 1. Moving on to DJ Moore, number 21. DJ Moore is a fantastic wide receiver. We know this. The only issue is the quarterback play going to be enough to help him get to that next level? Luckily, he plays against the Atlanta Falcons, the easiest matchup at the wide receiver position this week. Now, we know that A.J. Terrell has struggled mightily this year, and wide receivers have taken advantage of that left, right, and center, whether it was Boyd, Chase, or Higgins last week, all going for a combined, I don't even know how many fantasy points they put forth. Unbelievable numbers. I mean, Boyd had 8 catches for 155 and a touchdown. We saw, of course, Jamar Chase 130 plus with 8 catches, had himself 2 touchdowns in that game. Higgins had 5 catches for 93, could have had himself a touchdown, tackled short of the 1-yard line. But either way, we have seen the Atlanta Falcons give up 79 or more receiving yards to 5 different wide receivers over the last 2 games. There's a lot of potential here, especially for DJ Moore coming off of a hot week in which we really didn't expect him to do much, yet 10 targets, 7 catches, 69 yards, and a touchdown. With PJ Walker at quarterback, sounds good to fire him up for another week here. Let's move on to Amari Cooper. My biggest concern about Amari Cooper's overall potential is target opportunity and cornerback play. First and foremost, when you take on the Cincinnati Bengals, Chidobe Awuzie is probably going to be the number 1 corner. Eli Apple hasn't played well and probably won't see much of Amari Cooper. But as of right now, Chidobe Awuzie, he has been a legitimate top-tier cornerback in the league in terms of his production, in terms of coverage. Now, overall, I still think that Amari Cooper is a talented enough wide receiver when given opportunity to deliver. We've talked about it in weeks past. Whenever this man is being given 10 or more targets in a game, he's always scoring a touchdown, and he's always, double-digit fantasy points. That's all we want to see. So get him more opportunity in terms of the receiving game, and we'll have ourselves a great week here on Monday Night Football. Moving on, Courtland Sutton. Even though a lot of people are trying to sell Courtland Sutton, I'm willing to go ahead and buy Courtland Sutton because I know for a fact when Russell Wilson is back and under center and they have far more favorable matchups coming ahead of them, this should be a perfect combination for fantasy points and buying low on his current status. With Russell Wilson this season, Courtland Sutton is averaging 12.54 half PPR fantasy points per game, while there was 2 touchdowns called back in the first 3 weeks of the season. There could be even more fantasy points in the total scoreline of Courtland Sutton, but unfortunately there isn't. Yet with Russell Wilson, he's still averaging 9.2 targets per game, nearly 6 receptions, 83 receiving yards, and 0.2 receiving touchdowns per game. Overall, he's in a perfect position to succeed, and even with the backup quarterback last week, let's say, for example, Russ doesn't start this week. With Brett Rippon, he had 141 total air yards. Obviously wasn't able to take care of much because Sauce Gardner was locking him down, but there's a lot of potential to be had with Courtland Sutton going forward, especially with Russ under center. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. to close out the wide receiver 2 conversation. Listen, I like Michael Pittman Jr. I just don't know what we're going to expect from Sam Ehlinger. He's a mobile quarterback from Texas. He's going to play like a rookie. And quite frankly, if the Washington Commanders are going to play this right, they're going to stack the box and they're going to stop Jonathan Taylor as much as they possibly can, of course, and they're going to force Sam Ehlinger to beat them with his arm. And yes, maybe his average depth of target will be farther than what we've seen Matt Ryan produce. Like I mentioned on Monday's video waiver wire, as of the last 75 passing completions that Matt Ryan has had, I think 63 of them were of 10 or less, yardage down the field. Those kind of numbers are a big difference maker. So if in fact Sam Ehlinger is going to stretch the defense, allow Michael Pittman, Pierce, be deep receiving threats within this offense, there could be a lot of success for Michael Pittman Jr., especially against an advantageous matchup like the Washington Commanders. All right, let's go ahead, give you guys a visual representation as to what we have on screen, our wide receiver 2 conversation. I really do believe players like Gabriel Davis, DeVonta Smith, Christian Kirk, Tyler Lockett, these guys could easily be top 12 players within the given week. They just got to get those guaranteed targets that are always in flux. But if they're going in their direction, of course, we're going to see a massive performance out of them. Some of these guys like Chris Godwin, of course, are PPR machines, while other guys like Amari Cooper, Courtland Sutton, they are purely a matter of whether they score touchdowns and whether they're going to be relevant. Either way, this should give you a little bit of a gist as to where we're going this week. Hopefully you appreciate the visual representation. If you do, be sure to click the like button down below. Let's get into our wide receiver 3 conversation, beginning with Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. Like we were just talking about, the Commanders take on the Indianapolis Colts this week, and unfortunately for Terry McLaurin, he's going to have to see a lot of Stefon Gilmore. Stefon Gilmore this season really has been one of the best cornerbacks in the league, as he has been over the course of the last couple years. The best wide receiver performance against the Colts this season has come from Courtland Sutton, where he had 11 targets, 5 catches, and 74 receiving yards in that awful Thursday Night Football game. Imagine, that is the best performance from a wide receiver we have seen this year against this secondary, specifically as a number 1 wide receiver that is matching up one-on-one against Stefon Gilmore. Now, with that all being said, Terry McLaurin was able to succeed against another great secondary. He was able to put up points against Jair Alexander and Rasul Douglas, which of course they're great cornerbacks. As of right now, via Prize Picks, his current number is 57.5 receiving yards. Again, this could go either way. It's mainly going to be a test for Taylor Heinicke, because if Heinicke can play well, of course Terry McLaurin should be able to step up if Jahan Dotson misses here another week. As of right now, I'm expecting him to be in that high-end wide receiver 3 conversation, but that touchdown is the biggest difference maker as to his overall ranking within the given week. Moving on, Brandon Aiyuk coming off of back-to-back weeks of quite literally 11 targets. Let me go ahead and read these stat lines because they're almost identical. In week 6, 11 targets, 8 catches, 83 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The following week, against the Kansas City Chiefs, 11 targets, 7 catches, 82 yards, and 0 touchdowns. 24.3 fantasy points, 11.7. If we continue to get that 11.7 range, where he is getting a boatload of targets that is leading to receptions and, of course, yardage and a lot of yak in that capacity, when you go up against the LA Rams, it's one of the easiest matchups at the wide receiver position, and we know the 49ers have their number. And if they can accentuate the skills of Brandon Aiyuk to that level of getting him the ball down the field at a consistent rate, of course, we're going to see a lot of potential here as our number 26. Moving on to Jakobi Meyers, taking on the New York Jets. I think it has already been confirmed that Mac Jones will be starting. If that's going to be the case, of course, that helps. At least we have a stable quarterback, and we're not going to have to hope that Jakobi Meyers scores a touchdown. Now, thus far this season, from weeks 1 through 7, in the games that Jakobi Meyers has been active, he's been averaging 12.24 fantasy points per game, but he's never put up less than 8 fantasy points thus far this season. That gives me enough confidence to not only have him as a higher end wide receiver 3, but that he's probably going to have more upside than that, considering the matchup. If Sauce Gardner's holding down, Devontae Parker or Nelson Aguilar or Tyquan Thornton, I expect to see Jakobi Meyers in the slot position dominating across the board, getting a boatload of targets in his direction, and of course being the key difference maker within this passing scheme, assuming they're not throwing the ball to Ramondre Stevenson 8+ times once again, which again is a rare occasion. Moving on, let's talk about Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy had a great week. It was kind of anticipated that Courtland Sutton would disappear, and because of that, Jerry Jeudy would have a great performance. And that's pretty much what we saw and what we expected on Sunday morning when all things were settled regarding the quarterback position. With Brett Rippon, 11 targets, 7 catches, 96 yards. A great week overall. Now the question is, why can't we see that with Russell Wilson? This season with Russ, he's only averaging 8.27 fantasy points per game, which quite frankly isn't enough. Luckily, they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. It is an advantageous matchup, and quite recently, we've seen a lot of wide receivers succeed against this defense. Whether it was Slayton this last week, even Wan'Dale Robinson, before he got a little bit banged up, was finding himself a lot of utilization in the slot position. We saw the Colts wide receiver core go for 23 catches, 240 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns with Campbell, Pittman, and Pierce. We also saw A.J. Brown, 5 catches, 95, and Joshua Palmer recently out of the slot position, 6 catches, 99 receiving yards. There's been a lot of production against this Jacksonville Jaguars secondary. It's a matter of whether or not Russell Wilson in Europe is going to get the job done. Moving on, let's talk about Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson takes on the 49ers, and even though he didn't have a great stat line against them early on this season in week 4, I do want to mention one of the reasons why I'm back on board with Allen Robinson potentially being a wide receiver 3 option. Thus far this season, he's the number 2 receiving option in the National Football League in terms of red zone targets. He has a total of 8 targets that have led to 2 receptions. But if you go ahead and watch every single one of those targets down within the 10-yard line, it's quite frankly just been a factor of Matthew Stafford. If Matthew Stafford has a little bit better ball placement in a lot of these scenarios, he has himself 2 or 3 more touchdowns within the year. And if he has those touchdowns, he's easily a top 24 guy every single week. I think this upcoming week, of course, coming off the bye, it's going to be a matter of whether the Rams can unlock a little bit of their defense. Luckily, the number 1 quarterback of the 49ers is out for the season. And that could present a little bit of opportunity for Allen Robinson to step up and have himself a bigger game here. Moving on to George Pickens. George Pickens he keeps getting it done, especially with Kenny Pickett. When you go ahead and look at the 2.5 full games that Kenny Pickett, healthy, has played with George Pickens, Pickens is averaging 14.2 fantasy points per game, 7.6 targets, 6.4 receptions, 86 receiving yards, and 0.4 receiving touchdowns in the 2.5 games that they've played together. Overall, those are unbelievable statistics. The fact that they take on the Philadelphia Eagles, quite frankly, isn't something that bothers me. We've seen Hollywood Brown play well against them. We've seen even CeeDee Lamb with a backup quarterback play well against them. Jamal Agnew out of absolutely nowhere had 2 touchdown game against that defense. We have seen a lot of production, but as long as Kenny Pickett feels most comfortable throwing the ball in the direction of Diontae Johnson and George Pickens, of course, a lot of success will be had. Moving on to Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen's a touchdown machine. We know this. Now, I went ahead and did a little bit of digging. Of course, in the last 3 games that he's played against the Arizona Cardinals, he has scored a touchdown in every single one of those games. That's a great statistic, but he hasn't played some of those games in quite some time, and the secondaries look quite different. But luckily, Murphy, like we mentioned in regards to Justin Jefferson earlier and Wilson, they've been giving up their fair share of targets and receptions. Murphy's given up the 6th most receptions to opposing wide receivers this season, 30 total receptions, and Wilson's given up the 13th most receptions to opposing wide receivers, 25. If we're going to see Adam Thielen continue to get utilization down in the red zone, having scored about 1 touchdown every 3 games thus far this season, if he gets lucky, a touchdown could save his week and make him a massive play for our Week 8 purposes. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, taking on the Tennessee Titans. Even though the Tennessee Titans matchup is incredible, Brandin Cooks has been extremely underwhelming as of late. Average depth of target isn't fantastic, even though his air yards in some scenarios are great. Really, if you're not able to actualize those overall opportunities and deliver on a weekly basis, we can't trust you. But considering there is no more Nico Collins, and quite frankly, there's no one else to throw the ball to, and the Tennessee Titans have given up 300 minimum passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns when they've played against Wentz, Ryan, and Carr this season, why not Davis Mills? Of course, considering we've seen Matt Collins catch the ball 8 times, 158 in the touchdown against his secondary, and Diami Brown also had a game of 2 catches, 105 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Why not go ahead and take the top off the defense, Brandin Cooks, and have yourself a big game here? Moving on to Diontae Johnson. Now, Diontae Johnson is going to get his targets. In fact, he has had 30 targets in the last 3 weeks. In terms of total passing attempts, he's only getting about 23.8% of the target share, considering Kenny Pickett's throwing the ball about 40 plus times per game. But ultimately, as long as the targets are there 10 plus per game, that's a perfect scenario for success. Unfortunately, only catching about 5 of those targets for 42 yards isn't going to get the job done, which is why I have him lower ranked, especially when he's probably going to see Darius Slay for the majority of this upcoming weekend's matchup. Moving on to Rashod Bateman. I know he's currently dealing with a foot injury. It's a short week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on Thursday Night Football. But if Rashod Bateman is going to be active in any sort of capacity, this would be fantastic. Considering he had himself 4 receptions, and quite frankly, Lamar Jackson only had 8 passing completions on Sunday against the Cleveland Browns, he pretty much consisted of 50% of the receiving offense. Obviously, we'll probably see a little bit more of Lamar Jackson throwing the ball to Mark Andrews, getting more implementation there. But if Rashod Bateman is healthy, they're in desperate need of a wide receiver to be on the field. He only played about 56% of the offensive snaps on Sunday. So if we're in a situation where we could see him get a little bit more utilization, we're in a perfect position. Final thing I wanted to mention regarding Rashod Bateman on Sunday, could have had himself a receiving touchdown. Was tackled short on the 1. Gus Edwards comes in, yoinks the touchdown. What could have been? But either way, he's still a decent top 36 option. Moving on to Curtis Samuel, taking on the Indianapolis Colts. If in fact this, entire situation becomes Terry McLaurin being locked down and the only person to throw the ball to is Curtis Samuel, he's got great value. But the reason why I think he's got even more upside is because he had 5 rushing attempts for 26 rushing yards on Sunday. This offense as a whole ran the ball, I'm not even kidding, 36 times, 20 times with Brian Robinson, 10 times with Antonio Gibson, 1 rushing attempt via J.D. McKissic, and 5 times via Curtis Samuel. I mean, obviously we saw 2 rushing attempts from Taylor Heinicke, but I'm not even counting that as a direct play because those are improvised scrambles. But if in fact we're going to see rushing upside along with receiving upside within a given week, of course, Curtis Samuel increases his value that much more for potential upside. Moving on. Let's talk about Wan'Dale Robinson, the final wide receiver on today's list. I think Wan'Dale Robinson is probably in a decent position to succeed. It's just a matter of whether or not he's going to be healthy. Obviously, going from playing 15 snaps to 53 snaps is a big difference. And obviously, that target share increasing, leading the team in terms of total targets and receptions last week is huge for his overall baseline. It's just a matter of whether he's healthy because as of late, we have seen slot wide receivers succeed against the Seattle Seahawks, whether it's Rondale Moore or even Chris Olave recently. If Wan'Dale can get himself some, full practices by the end of the week and get that designation, it'll give me that much more confidence in starting him this upcoming week. All right, that's going to cover it for today's video. Let me go ahead and show you guys our wide receiver threes. That's pretty much going to cover it. Again, a lot of these wide receivers can have upside weeks, but they're not given as many targets. They're not as much of a factor within their overall offense, but hopefully tides are going to shift. Hopefully some of these players are going to be big difference makers in the coming week, especially the younger players like a George Pickens and a Wan'Dale Robinson that could do it every single week at a high rate. Either way, if you want updated rankings, join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll be live streaming here on the channel with updated rankings at all 4 primary positions on screen to answer your own questions. Either way, thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to like the video. Of course, subscribe if you have not yet already, and check out PrizePicks. Again, we mentioned a lot of potential entries going into this upcoming weekend, picking more or less. Obviously, I'm always someone that wants to pick more on total entries. I never want to root against players. It's not in my blood to do so, especially considering how much I love fantasy football. I always want to see players continue to put up more points than we potentially expect. Either way, thank you everybody for watching. Check out the link down in the description via PrizePicks. Use promo code Andrew. And until tomorrow, we'll be talking about a rest of season strength of schedule. I'll see you guys. Peace.